What we're looking at here is a Sumerian tablet that actually shows the tree of life, flanked by divine beings. You can see here the Anunnaki on each side.
What if everything we've been taught about the world's first civilization is fundamentally wrong? Imagine a language and a culture so ancient that it predates the Bible, yet our comprehension of it might be flawed to the core. For decades, one man stood as the unrivaled authority on Sumer, the cradle of civilization, until his final revelations almost shattered the academic world. This expert's last words were a haunting confession. The texts we rely on aren't just misunderstood in details, but in their very framework. What if the gods they described weren't gods at all? The unsettling doubts of a legend. Samuel Noah Kramer wasn't just a scholar of ancient Sumer. For more than half a century, he was the living bridge between the modern world and humanity's earliest civilization. His name is etched in every textbook, every museum exhibit, and every lecture discussing Sumerian history. For decades, his translations and interpretations were treated as gospel, shaping how millions understood the dawn of civilization. Yet, in the twilight of his life, Kramer made a startling confession that rattled the very foundation of his work. At 91 years old and weeks from death, Kramer sat quietly in a dusty basement, surrounded by thousands of clay tablets only he could read. These inscriptions, pressed into clay more than 4,000 years ago, had been his life's mission to decipher. But something had shifted. He revealed to the camera, in a voice barely more than a whisper, that everything we believed about Sumer might be fundamentally wrong, not just in details, but in the entire framework of understanding. For years, colleagues dismissed his growing doubts as the ramblings of an aging mind too long confined with ancient texts. But the seeds of uncertainty had taken root deep inside Kramer's thoughts. Footnotes in his academic papers became increasingly cautious, then troubled. He noted passages that had no clear meaning and concepts that seemed impossible to translate accurately. These were not minor translation errors. They challenged the very assumptions we held about Sumerian culture and language. The most unsettling realization was that the Sumerian language lacked words for many concepts we consider fundamental, like religion or miracles. This absence wasn't a gap to fill, but a sign that the Sumerians didn't think in the terms modern scholars expected. They did not divide experience between sacred and secular, natural and supernatural, as we do now. It suggested that our interpretation was shaped more by modern categories than genuine understanding. Despite being the leading authority, Kramer confessed the possibility that he had spent decades imposing a modern worldview onto these ancient texts. His lifelong work might have been a brilliant but mistaken attempt to fit a civilization's thinking into frameworks they never used. This admission was seismic, especially for a field that had long relied on his translations as definitive. Yet, Kramer's courage to question his own legacy spoke to a scholar desperate for truth. His doubts culminated in a single tablet he had translated 40 years earlier. For decades, he accepted its narrative at face value, gods bestowing civilization on primitive humans. But that story no longer sat right with him. As he stared again at the worn clay in his final days, attempting to forget his own previous interpretations, an alternative reading began to emerge, one that challenged everything he thought he knew. Transitioning from doubt to language reveals why understanding the Sumerian tongue is not as straightforward as it seems, and why its structure forces us to rethink our assumptions about ancient thought. Breaking down the language barrier. The Sumerian language is one of the oldest known written languages, preserved in countless clay tablets that have survived millennia. But unlike modern languages, Sumerian is fundamentally different in ways that complicate translation. When Kramer began his work in the 1920s, Sumerian was effectively a dead language. No native speakers, no dictionaries, and no instruction manuals. He had to painstakingly rebuild its vocabulary by comparing fragments across thousands of texts. One of the biggest challenges was that Sumerian lacked words for key concepts familiar to us now. Crucially, there was no direct word for religion and no clear separation between natural and supernatural events. The idea of miracles, as violations of natural law, did not exist because there was no baseline concept of natural to be violated. This absence forced Kramer to confront the uncomfortable reality that ancient Sumerian thought did not frame its experience using categories that modern minds take for granted. The word, often translated as God, did not refer to anthropomorphic deities in the way later cultures imagined them. Instead, it more closely resembled ideas of great power or a cosmic principle. These were not beings worshipped in a religious sense, but perhaps symbolic or conceptual representations of forces or states of being. This meant the familiar narrative of capricious gods actively intervening in human affairs might be a misreading influenced by our cultural biases. The first translations Kramer performed used English words like creation and world, but he later recognized that Sumerians did not understand those concepts according to modern definitions. The texts probably describe an entirely different concept which does not match current modern definitions. Mainstream academia has lost track of this particular nuance because academic institutions impose their existing knowledge systems on languages they do not understand. Sumerian translation presents its highest challenges through its contextual requirements. The tablets contain both myths and laws, together with advanced astronomical information and mathematical systems which exist in a language that does not permit simple classification. Kramer observed that humans perceive base 10 as a standard mathematical system due to their 10 fingers, while Sumerians used base 60, which provides exceptional divisibility through its elegant design that may represent a different numeric perception. The complex language system creates barriers to understanding, while it compels us to examine whether our existing mental models can comprehend ancient Sumerian wisdom. Kramer established his self-directed learning achievements, which remained unmatched for 30 years, until he showed his first doubts about his knowledge. The language shows a complete alien thought process, which exists outside our normal understanding. So any attempt at word-for-word translation will always fail to reveal the actual core message. The puzzle of language opens the door to a revelation, a single tablet, that disturbed Kramer's lifelong certainty and shifted his understanding in a way few could have anticipated. The tablet that broke the narrative, the tablet responsible for shaking Kramer's convictions, came from the ancient city of Nippur, dating back to around 2100 before the Common Era. It sat, largely ignored, in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's collection for decades before Kramer published its translation in 1949. At first glance, the tablet seemed to fit perfectly into the accepted narrative, a conversation between a god and a human, explaining how civilization was granted as a divine gift. This story aligned with a widespread belief that early civilizations saw their knowledge and technology as heavenly blessings handed down by gods. The gods were thought to intervene directly, creating humanity and shaping culture. Kramer's initial translation mirrored this tradition, reinforcing the idea that civilization arrived as a favor from supernatural overlords, just as seen in Egyptian or Greek myths. Despite this acceptance, something about the tablet gnawed at Kramer over the next 40 years. The words that once seemed clear began to feel like a puzzle with missing pieces. When he revisited it in 1988 at the age of 91, Kramer spent hours in the basement, turning the tablet over in his hands, struggling to see it through fresh eyes rather than through decades of assumptions. What emerged was a revelation that stunned him, and could stun us. Kramer realized the word he had translated as gift could also mean awakening or remembering. The term for human might better be understood as the sleeping one or unaware one, and the word for God could be interpreted as fully conscious one or aware power. This subtle shift turned the entire tablet inside out. It no longer described gods giving civilization to primitive humans, but instead depicted humans awakening to abilities they had all along. This meant the gods might not have been external beings at all, but rather symbolic descriptions of higher states of consciousness or awareness that ancient Sumerians experienced, and later lost. Civilization, in this light, emerged from inner transformation rather than external divine intervention. It was as if the ancients encoded a map of human consciousness rather than a myth of supernatural gifts. Kramer showed this reinterpretation to his peers, triggering shock and disbelief. One colleague reportedly went pale, recognizing that embracing this reading would invalidate decades of work, textbooks, and dissertations. Others urged Kramer to rest, expressing concern that he was crossing from rigorous scholarship into something more fragile, a mental breakdown. But Kramer himself could not unsee this truth once it dawned on him. This tablet was not just another artifact, it was a key to understanding the profound disconnect between modern and ancient ways of thinking. It suggested we have been reading these tablets through the wrong lens, one shaped by contemporary assumptions rather than ancient realities. The true story, embedded in a forgotten language and culture, still waits to be fully understood. With these early cracks in translation exposed, the story turns toward what these shifted meanings might reveal about the very nature of Sumerian awareness and civilization itself. Consciousness versus civilization. What Kramer uncovered in that tablet upended the traditional view of Sumerian civilization as a story of gods granting gifts to humans. Instead, it suggested that what we call gods might have been symbolic markers of different states of consciousness or awareness, the line between divine and human blurred, replaced by a spectrum of mental states, sleeping, awakening, fully conscious, that expressed the experience of reality itself. This radical idea challenges our common assumption that ancient peoples worshipped gods as external supernatural beings like we envision today. The implications run far deeper than mythology. If these gods were modes of awareness rather than characters in a story, then the Sumerians were communicating something about human potential, something lost to us now. Their texts might be encoded descriptions of cognitive shifts, inner awakenings that transformed how individuals and society functioned. This perception frames civilization not as a gift from outside forces, but as an evolution from within, an emergence of consciousness that unlocked new capabilities. Kramer started seeing these patterns everywhere, in their mathematics, astronomy, and technology. The precise base 60 system they used wasn't an arbitrary choice, but a reflection of how their consciousness organized numbers and relationships in ways foreign to modern minds, grounded in base 10. Their detailed star charts and planetary cycles weren't merely careful observations. Kramer proposed they might have been direct perceptions of cosmic patterns, revealing a deeper connection between human awareness and the universe. Even their technological advancements, irrigation, metallurgy, urban planning, could be reinterpreted under this lens. Rather than attributing knowledge to divine intervention alone, Kramer wondered if these breakthroughs emerged from sudden cognitive shifts, unique states of mind that made some technologies almost self-evident. It paints a picture of a civilization evolving not just physically, but mentally, accessing states of understanding that our usual frameworks can't easily grasp. Yet this perspective exposes a troubling gap between us and them. Modern consciousness compartmentalizes reality into neat categories: natural versus supernatural, human versus divine. The Sumerians, Kramer argued, operated on an integrated worldview that combined material reality with cosmic principles seamlessly. This fundamental difference in perception could explain why ancient texts confound readers. They are locked in a mindset that is no longer accessible through ordinary rational thought. Accepting this idea also forces a rethink of what progress means. We tend to assume our current scientific and technological advancements mark a steady rise from primitive beginnings. But Kramer's insights suggest that earlier humans might have possessed cognitive capacities that have since faded or transformed. The gods of Sumer might represent heights of consciousness rather than mythical rulers, hinting at abilities and understandings beyond modern reach. This reinterpretation unsettled many in the academic world, where centuries-old frameworks resisted upheaval. But for Kramer, it was an unavoidable truth he could neither deny nor fully articulate. He described himself as trapped in the very modern consciousness that obscured the Sumerian mindset, trying to translate a language of thought radically different from his own. The collapse of Sumer was not just a political or social breakdown, but something far stranger, a fading of a unique way of experiencing the world. Collapse as a cognitive shift. The fall of Sumer around 2000, before the Common Era, is often told as a familiar tale of conquest, abandoned cities, and the scattering of peoples. Yet Kramer's late studies hint at a more profound explanation. Sumer did not just collapse politically, it suffered a cognitive decline. The astonishing mental frameworks that underpinned its brilliance appeared to wane, leaving the civilization bereft of the consciousness that had made its achievements possible. Late-period tablets reveal a stark shift in thought quality. Earlier texts brimmed with complex cosmic ideas and integrated mathematics. Later ones became more concrete, pragmatic, and detached from cosmic principle. It was as if the minds writing these texts no longer fully understood the original worldview or its deeper meanings. This decline in cognitive depth paralleled the historical unraveling of the culture, suggesting the two were intertwined. Kramer also pointed to the behavior of the famed Sumerian king list, where extraordinarily long reigns of tens of thousands of years gave way to more normal, historically plausible rulerships. Traditionally, this has been interpreted as mythology gradually transitioning into real history, but Kramer saw it differently. The king list traced a cognitive shift, a shrinking of perception from boundless, almost timeless consciousness to more limited, human-scale awareness. The fading of those early modes of consciousness meant that, with time, the collective imagination and understanding of Sumer's people contracted. Their worldview lost the multidimensional quality that had connected celestial and earthly realities so seamlessly. The civilization they created could no longer maintain the same complex relationships between society, technology, astronomy, and spirituality. This loss may explain why later Sumerians appeared to struggle with their own ancestors' texts, writing in a style that seemed to distance itself from original meanings. It was a cognitive fracture, a gap between past and present thought, not merely a shift in political power or social structure. What's haunting is Kramer's suggestion that this cognitive collapse was irreversible. Once the ancient mode of consciousness faded, Sumer could no longer sustain the civilization it had birthed. The disappearance of certain states of awareness might have doomed not just a culture, but an entire way of knowing reality itself. Modern descendants of Sumer live in the aftermath of this deep change, heirs to a history they struggle to fully comprehend. Our inability to translate these ancient ideas effectively might stem from being on the far side of that cognitive divide, unable to access the consciousness that once infused those writings. Seeing civilization itself as a product of shifting consciousness prepares us to grasp the final and most difficult lessons about what Sumer's legacy means for us today. Lost knowledge and modern limitations. Samuel Noah Kramer's final insights challenge us to consider that the ancient Sumerians possessed forms of consciousness and understanding that we have not only lost, but may be fundamentally incapable of fully recovering. The clay tablets left behind are still there, in museums and archives, covered with symbols we can technically translate. Yet, Kramer warned that we are reading words without truly grasping their meanings because we are translating language, not consciousness. This gap is where so much of the mystery and confusion lies. The academic establishment has largely marginalized Kramer's late-life doubts and the radical reinterpretations they inspired. Many textbooks and lectures continue to rely on his earlier translations, reinforcing a familiar narrative of primitive humans receiving civilization as a divine gift. But a small but growing group of researchers in consciousness studies and cognitive anthropology have begun revisiting these texts with Kramer's insights in mind. Their findings suggest that what appeared to be myths might instead be sophisticated descriptions of mental states and ways of being. This resistance from mainstream archaeology and history partly stems from institutional inertia. Careers and reputations built on established interpretations are difficult to dismantle. Yet, a deeper reason may be fear. Acknowledging that the Sumerians had capacities no longer accessible to us forces us to question our assumed place at the pinnacle of human progress. Are we truly more advanced? Or have we sacrificed essential ways of knowing in exchange for technology and rationality? Kramer proposed that progress might not be a simple linear ascent. Instead, as societies gained certain abilities, scientific knowledge, tools, organized governance, they may have lost others related to perception, awareness, and integrated consciousness. The Sumerians may have inhabited a mode of existence richer in certain cognitive dimensions, now vanished or dormant. Their gods and mythologies could be windows into those lost mental landscapes. This perspective leads to a humbling realization. Our modern consciousness, conditioned by centuries of rationalism and empirical science, might inherently limit our ability to decode and internalize ancient wisdom. The ancient world was shaped by a different experiential reality and worldview, one that resists translation into our terms. Understanding them fully might demand a transformation in how we think and perceive ourselves and the world. If Kramer is right, it means our understanding of history, religion, and human potential has been framed by blind spots for nearly a century. The very foundation of archaeology and ancient history, our translations and interpretations, may have skewed the truth so deeply that what we teach as fact is only part of the story, missing the crucial human dimension of consciousness. Outro. Samuel Noah Kramer's final revelations show us that history isn't just about facts. It's about understanding the minds that shaped those facts. If ancient Sumerians truly experienced reality differently, we must rethink what we think we know. If you're intrigued by lost knowledge and hidden truths, like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into forbidden history. Your journey into the untold begins now.